They called me a fat cow. Not behind my back, not whispered in a corner, but straight to my face, in a room full of people who were supposed to be my family. My son's wife said it with a smile that cut like a knife, and her wealthy relatives laughed as though humiliating me was some kind of sport. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, my face burning. I didn't cry, I didn't lash out, I just stayed quiet. But inside, something broke. A part of me that had always been gentle, always willing to overlook, suddenly hardened. That night, I realized I was done being the woman they mocked, the woman they dismissed. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that their laughter would soon turn to silence. Because the same man who laughed the loudest, the same man who raised the woman married to my son, was about to discover who I really was. I wasn't some poor, pitiful woman they could trample on. I wasn't just their son-in-law's mother. No, I was his new boss. And the look on his face when he realized it, that look alone was worth every tear I swallowed in silence. But let me take you back. Because this story isn't just about one insult. It's about betrayal, about family, about a son who stood by while I was ridiculed, and about the quiet kind of revenge that doesn't need shouting to leave a mark. It's about dignity, and the kind of strength you don't know you have until you're forced to stand alone. And before we go further, if you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. Don't just sit there quietly. It means more than you realize. Now, let me ask you something. What would you do if your own child's spouse mocked you in front of everyone? Would you bite your tongue like I did that night? Or would you rise up and show them who you really are? I grew up in a modest neighborhood, the kind where folks knew each other's names, where front porches were meant for evening conversations, and where you learned the value of hard work early. My parents weren't wealthy, but they raised me with grit and respect. I carried those lessons into adulthood, and when I had my son, Michael, I promised myself he'd never feel small in this world. I worked 2 jobs for years, juggling laundry late at night, folding shirts still warm from the dryer while my son did his homework at the kitchen table. I'd wake up before sunrise, pack lunches, and then head to my shift. There were nights I'd come home with my feet aching, but one smile from him made everything worth it. Every Sunday, no matter how exhausted I was, I cooked a proper dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, biscuits from scratch. That was my way of saying, we may not have much, but we have each other. Michael grew into a kind young man, respectful, the kind of son mothers pray for. He was quiet but ambitious, smart enough to see beyond our circumstances. He earned scholarships, pushed himself through college, and when he called me one day saying he'd met someone special, I wanted to believe it was the beginning of something good. Her name was Rebecca. She was beautiful, polished, the type of woman who grew up with money. The first time he brought her home, she walked into my kitchen with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I remember I was wearing my faded apron, stirring gravy in my old skillet. She looked around the house, her gaze landing on the worn furniture, the little pictures of Michael taped up on the fridge. She said the right words. "Oh, what a cozy place you have here." But the way she smoothed her designer blouse while she said it made me feel like my home was beneath her. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being sensitive. But when she sat down at the table and poked at the food like it was foreign, I felt it. She didn't belong in our world. And worse, she didn't want to. The differences were clear from the start. I wore practical shoes from the discount store. She wore heels that probably cost more than my week's paycheck. I drove an old sedan that rattled in the winter. She arrived in her father's gleaming black SUV. I packed leftovers for Michael in plastic containers. She gifted him sleek lunchboxes with compartments I'd never seen before. And through it all, she smiled that smile, a tight, practiced smile that held no warmth. I tried to welcome her anyway. I invited her to join us for Sunday dinners. I asked about her family, her job, her dreams. But every time she answered, her tone had an edge. "Oh, I don't really eat fried food," she once said, pushing my chicken aside. "My mom's housekeeper usually makes healthier meals." And she laughed lightly, as if to soften the blow. But it didn't soften. It stung. Michael didn't notice at first. Love has a way of blinding young people. He looked at her like she was the sun itself, as though she could do no wrong. And I stayed quiet, because the last thing I wanted was to come between my son and his happiness. Still, I couldn't ignore the small slights, the way she'd look at my clothes as if she pitied me, the way she'd correct the way I pronounced certain words, tilting her head with a smirk, or how she'd offer to help me in the kitchen, but instead of helping, she'd criticize my old pots and pans. "You know, stainless steel is much better," she once said, tapping my skillet like it was trash. I swallowed those moments, convincing myself that maybe it was just her way, that she didn't mean harm. But deep down, I felt a wall rising between us, a wall built from money, privilege, and subtle cruelty. The turning point came one evening when she invited me to dinner at her parents' house. It was the first time I'd ever stepped into a home like that. Marble floors, a chandelier that sparkled like something out of a movie, glasses clinking and hands manicured to perfection. I wore my best dress, the one I'd kept neatly pressed for church. But standing in that room, I felt small again, just like I had as a girl when I couldn't afford the right shoes for school. Her mother greeted me with a cold smile, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. Her father barely shook my hand, distracted by the wine he was pouring. And Rebecca stood there, introducing me like I was an inconvenience. "This is Michael's mom," she said, her tone flat, as if she were embarrassed to claim me as part of their family. At the table, the conversation circled around vacations I'd never take, country clubs I'd never see, and investments I couldn't even pretend to understand. I nodded, I smiled, I tried, but inside, I was crumbling. The final sting of that evening wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It came when Rebecca leaned across the table to her cousin, whispering just loud enough for me to hear, "She reminds me of the women who clean our pool. Always polite, but so simple." The cousin giggled, covering her mouth with her hand. I didn't say a word. I sat there, my fork resting on the plate, my throat tight. And that was when I knew. This wasn't just tension. This wasn't just difference. This was disrespect. This was a line being crossed, again and again, in front of the one person who should have defended me. And Michael? My son just sat there, smiling, lost in love, blind to the fact that his own mother was being chipped away piece by piece. I went home that night with my best dress hanging heavy on my shoulders, the smell of their expensive candles clinging to the fabric. I stood in my small kitchen, staring at the skillet that had fed us for years, and I thought, how do you fight against a family that looks at you like you're nothing? How do you protect your place when the woman your son loves is determined to strip it away? That was the question that kept me awake long after midnight, folding laundry I'd already folded, just to keep my hands busy, just to keep from crying. The day of my son's wedding should have been the proudest moment of my life. I woke up early that morning, ironed the dress I had chosen months in advance, and stood in front of the mirror for a long time. It wasn't expensive or designer, but it was tasteful, a navy blue gown with a soft neckline, something I thought looked elegant without being loud. I pinned my hair carefully, slipped on a simple necklace, and told myself this day wasn't about me. It was about my son. If he was happy, I would find a way to be happy too. When I arrived at the venue, I realized quickly that happiness would not come so easily. It wasn't a church wedding like I'd always imagined. It was a sprawling estate, with white tents stretched across manicured lawns, crystal glasses lined up on linen-covered tables, and servers gliding around with trays of champagne. It looked like something out of a magazine, beautiful, yes, but cold. The guests were dressed in gowns and suits that shimmered with wealth. Diamonds glittered on fingers, expensive perfume floated through the air, and the chatter was filled with talk of vacations to Paris and investments in companies I'd never even heard of. I held my small clutch bag a little tighter, trying not to let my insecurity show. I walked slowly toward the seating area, praying no one would notice how my shoes weren't designer or how I hesitated before stepping onto the marble walkway. I spotted Rebecca's family near the front, clustered together like they owned the place, which, in many ways, they did. Her mother wore a gown that could have walked straight off a runway. Her father's suit was perfectly tailored, and their friends circled them like satellites, laughing, sipping, smiling. They looked so at ease, while I felt like an intruder in my own son's story. When Rebecca finally appeared, walking down the aisle in her white gown, the crowd gasped with admiration. And I'll admit it, she was stunning. The dress clung perfectly, the veil floated, the light seemed to follow her. But as I looked at her, a pang of sorrow cut through me. She was beautiful, yes, but her beauty was laced with arrogance, and I could see it in the tilt of her chin, the way her eyes darted toward me with a glint that wasn't kindness. I smiled anyway. I smiled because that's what mothers do. I clapped softly when the vows were said, when the rings were exchanged, when the kiss sealed it. I swallowed the lump in my throat, when my son, my only child, looked at her with devotion so fierce that I wondered if he even remembered I was sitting just a few feet away. At the reception, I tried to blend in. I sat at my table, listened to the music, forced myself to eat a little of the food that had been plated so delicately it looked more like art than dinner. But as I ate, I could feel eyes on me. Whispered voices drifted across the table. I heard snippets words like out of place and plain and too much fabric. I lowered my gaze to my plate, pretending I hadn't heard. Then came the laughter. At first, soft, behind manicured hands, then sharper, bolder, and then the words that seared themselves into me forever. She looks like a fat cow in that dress. I froze. The words hung in the air like smoke. I didn't have to ask who said it. I knew Rebecca's voice by now. It was laced with that same sharp sweetness she always used when she wanted to sting. The group around her laughed, her cousins, her friends, even her mother chuckled softly, as if it was nothing more than a harmless joke. I felt my chest tighten, my hands trembling under the tablecloth. My fork clinked against the plate as I tried to keep steady. My son was sitting just a few chairs away, close enough to have heard. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something, to stop it, to defend me the way a son should defend his mother. But he didn't. He shifted uncomfortably, glanced at me once, then looked away. He raised his glass to his new wife and forced a smile, as if pretending he hadn't heard a thing. That silence was louder than Rebecca's insult. I sat there, smiling faintly, forcing my lips to curve upward while my heart sank deeper with every beat. I wanted to leave, to get up and walk out of that glittering hall filled with people who saw me as nothing but a punchline. But I stayed. I stayed because walking out would mean letting them win, letting them see me broken. So I swallowed the pain. I sat upright, smoothed my dress over my lap, and pretended their words hadn't pierced me. Inside, though, the wound was deep. The girl I had welcomed into my home, cooked for, tried to embrace, had stripped me of my dignity in front of her entire world, and my own son let her. As the night went on, the music swelled, the dancing began, the toasts were made. Everyone cheered, glasses clinked, laughter filled the air. But for me, the sound was hollow. I watched Rebecca twirl across the dance floor, her gown flowing, her smile wide, while my son followed her like a shadow. And I sat in silence, wondering how the boy, I had raised my boy, who once sat at my kitchen table with jelly-stained fingers, who hugged me after every baseball game, who promised he would never forget me, could allow me to be humiliated like that. When the evening finally ended, I walked to my car alone. My heels clicked against the stone path, echoing in the quiet night. I drove home with my dress wrinkled, my makeup smudged, and a heaviness in my chest that no tears could relieve. That was the night I understood something I had never wanted to believe. Sometimes the people you love most will stand by while others tear you apart. And sometimes the silence of your own child hurts more than the cruelest insult from a stranger. At the time I thought I had already tasted the worst of humiliation, but nothing prepared me for what happened the night I was invited to dinner at my daughter-in-law's family estate. The moment the invitation came, I knew it wasn't about kindness or family bonding. It was a performance, a stage where I was meant to be a prop, the small-town mother displayed against the marble floors and glittering chandeliers of their world. Still, I agreed to go. Maybe part of me still hoped they might see me as a person, not as an embarrassment to be tolerated. The estate was enormous, its driveway lined with imported stone lanterns that lit the way up to the towering mansion. I could feel my throat tighten as I parked my modest car among the gleaming luxury vehicles. My hands shook when I fixed my hair in the rearview mirror, smoothing down the curls I had set with drugstore rollers. I wore my best dress, navy blue with a pearl brooch, but the moment I stepped inside, the judgment fell on me like a wave. The foyer smelled of polished wood and expensive perfume. Everywhere I turned, women in sparkling gowns and men in tailored suits seemed to glide past me, their conversations laced with mentions of overseas vacations and investment portfolios. I tried to smile, to blend in. But I felt the weight of eyes on me, measuring me, labeling me, dismissing me. At the long dining table, set with silverware I didn't even recognize how to use, I took a seat near the edge. My daughter-in-law floated in like a queen, her sequin dress hugging her perfectly slim frame. She smiled sweetly at her family, but when her eyes landed on me, that smile twisted ever so slightly. The small talk began, polite on the surface but sharp underneath. One woman asked me where I usually dined. When I told her I enjoyed making Sunday roasts at home, she gave me a polite laugh and said, "Oh, how quaint." Another man asked if my line of work was keeping me busy. When I explained I worked long shifts at a local clinic, he raised an eyebrow as though the very idea of working with your hands was foreign. Then came the moment that made my stomach clench. A lavish dish was served, something with truffle oil and foam on top. My daughter-in-law picked up her fork with delicate precision, then looked across the table at me and said loudly, "You know, my husband always says your food reminds him of greasy diner plates. Isn't that right, sweetheart?" My son shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but didn't deny it. I felt my cheeks flush hot. Laughter trickled around the table, soft at first, then bolder. My heart sank. I held my breath, gripping my napkin beneath the table, trying to stop my hands from trembling. I thought that was the end of it, but then she said it. She leaned toward her family, her voice dripping with mockery, and announced, "This is the fat cow we have to endure." The room erupted in laughter, real, open laughter, like they were watching a comedy show. I froze in my seat, my fork halfway to my lips, unable to move. My body went rigid, my ears burned, my heart pounded so loud I could hear it echo in my head. I stared down at my plate, the food blurring in front of me, and in that moment, I felt something inside me fracture. I had endured small remarks, whispers behind closed doors, little smirks passed between them, but this was different. This was public. This was deliberate. I turned my eyes toward my son, hoping, praying, begging silently that he would speak up, that he would say, "Don't talk about my mother that way." But he didn't. He just lowered his eyes, pretending not to hear, as if silence would shield him from the shame of being connected to me. That betrayal cut deeper than any insult. My throat ached as I forced down the lump in my chest. I smiled faintly, pretending not to care, but the laughter still rang in my ears like a cruel echo. I wanted to disappear, to vanish into the marble floor. I sat there quietly, chewing food I couldn't taste, listening to them go on about vacations in Italy, about wine imported from France, about stocks and mergers I didn't understand. My daughter-in-law occasionally glanced at me with smug satisfaction, as if she had successfully put me in my place. And yet, behind my silence, behind my lowered gaze, something began to take shape inside me. A quiet, steady fire. They thought they had broken me, humiliated me into silence forever. But what they didn't know was that humiliation is not the end of a woman like me. It's the beginning of something else. That night, as I sat in that glittering hall surrounded by people who laughed at my pain, I made a decision. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I would not remain the woman they mocked. I would not forever be their fat cow. No, one day I would show them the truth. But before that, I ask you, if you had been in that seat, surrounded by laughter, your own child too cowardly to defend you, would you have walked out right then? Or would you have stayed, swallowing the pain, waiting for the right moment to strike back? Because that's exactly what I did. I sat there at the table, the laughter still stinging my ears, when suddenly something changed. I noticed my daughter-in-law's father. He was the loudest of them all, laughing so hard he wiped his eyes with his napkin, shaking his head like I was the punchline of a joke that would last him all week. But then his laughter slowed. His smile faltered. His eyes, sharp and calculating, landed on me in a way that was different from the others. At first, I thought he was just staring out of pity. Maybe he realized they had gone too far. But no, this was something else. His brows pinched together, his jaw stiffened, and the color drained just slightly from his cheeks. He kept glancing from me to his daughter, back to me again, as if his brain was scrambling to put puzzle pieces together. Then, in the middle of that glittering dining hall, with silver forks clinking and conversations flowing around him, he blurted out words that sliced through the room like glass. "Wait, aren't you my new boss?" The laughter stopped instantly. The forks froze halfway to lips. Every head at the table turned toward him, then toward me. Confusion painted across their faces. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The kind of silence that presses down on you until even breathing feels like a betrayal. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Inside, my heart was pounding so hard I thought they could all hear it. My mind replayed the last few weeks at work, the announcement of my promotion, the new accounts I had been assigned to oversee, and then it hit me. I knew the name on the contract, the prestigious firm that had landed a major partnership with our company. His name, her family's company. The contract was under my authority now. I lifted my eyes slowly, meeting his gaze across the table. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't even blink. I just looked at him, steady and calm, letting him stew in the realization. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat, clearly confused. "Dad, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice high and brittle. But he didn't answer her. His eyes stayed locked on me, a flicker of panic crossing his expression. He swallowed hard, tugged at his collar, and tried to compose himself, but the damage was already done. The air had shifted. The power dynamic that once sat so comfortably on their side of the table had tilted, and everyone could feel it. I leaned back slightly in my chair, still calm, still composed. I could feel the eyes of the entire table on me, waiting for me to explain, waiting for me to either confirm or deny what he had said. But I chose silence. I chose to let him squirm, to let his own words hang in the air like smoke no one could clear. Inside, though, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Vindication. For the first time that evening, I wasn't the subject of ridicule. I was the one holding the unspoken truth that could shatter their arrogance in an instant. He cleared his throat finally, forcing out a nervous laugh. I must be mistaken," he said, but his voice cracked, betraying him. His family looked at him curiously, wondering what on earth he meant, but he waved them off quickly, picking at his plate, avoiding my eyes now like I carried the weight of his shame. The rest of the dinner dragged on, but the atmosphere had changed. No one laughed as freely anymore. Their jokes fell flat, their voices subdued, their stolen glances toward me tinged with uncertainty. My daughter-in-law still tried to play the hostess, forcing laughter, but I saw the flicker of unease in her eyes each time her father avoided my gaze. I sat there quietly, eating bite after bite of food I didn't even taste, my mind racing. I knew I had a choice. I could have humiliated him right then, revealed everything in front of his smug, wealthy family, stripped him of the pride he so openly flaunted. But I didn't. I swallowed it down, choosing patience over impulse. Because revenge, I realized, is sweeter when it isn't rushed. It's most powerful when it comes at a time no one expects, when it's delivered in silence, with precision. So I let them finish their wine, let them chatter on about vacations and investments, let them continue believing I was nothing more than the fat cow they had mocked. But inside, I knew. I knew the tables had already turned. I was no longer the woman they could humiliate without consequence. I was the woman holding the pen that could sign or shred their future. As I pushed my chair back and stood at the end of that long meal, I left the table without another word. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I walked out of the estate, my head held higher than when I had entered. They thought they had seen me broken that night. What they didn't know was that they had only witnessed the beginning of their own undoing. And as I stepped into the cool night air, I asked myself quietly, should I let them know what I was capable of now? Or should I wait, watch them laugh a little longer, before pulling the ground right out from under their feet? Because sometimes, silence is the sharpest blade of all. When I walked out of that dinner, I carried more than humiliation with me. I carried a secret, a card tucked neatly up my sleeve that none of them could see. My daughter-in-law's father had recognized me that night, and though he tried to cover it up, I saw the fear in his eyes. That fear became my quiet strength. I knew that from then on, every interaction between us would shift. He might still try to play the role of the powerful patriarch at his grand table, but in my world, the world of contracts, deadlines, and numbers, I held the pen. The first time we met again after that dinner was in the conference room of my company. The table wasn't lined with fine china or crystal glasses. This time it was stacks of papers, spreadsheets projected onto the wall, contracts waiting for signatures. He walked in, flanked by his team, his suit perfectly tailored, his shoes gleaming. But when his eyes met mine across the table, I saw it, that flicker of unease, that flash of memory from the night his daughter mocked me, and he laughed the loudest. I greeted him the way I greeted all clients, calm, professional, no hint of the storm beneath my skin. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," I said smoothly, motioning toward the chair opposite mine. He hesitated just a beat too long before sitting down, his smile tight, his voice a little too rehearsed when he replied. As the meeting went on, I kept my tone steady and my posture straight. Every question I asked, every condition I laid out, reminded him that in this room, his wealth and arrogance didn't protect him. Here, I was the one who set the pace. I didn't need to raise my voice or bring up that dinner. My silence did the work for me. Every time his eyes flicked nervously toward me, I knew he remembered. At home, I carried on as usual, but everything I did had a new sense of purpose. I folded laundry in the quiet of the evening, my hands moving automatically while my mind replayed every smirk, every cruel word. I baked pies for Sunday afternoons, the scent of cinnamon and butter filling my kitchen, while thinking of how different the table felt when my family gathered around warm, simple, real, compared to the cold performance of their banquets. There were nights when my phone buzzed with text messages from my daughter-in-law. Short, clipped words dripping with disdain. "Don't embarrass us at the gala. Wear something decent this time. Please, just stay quiet." At first, I used to reply, short and polite, trying to keep peace. But now, I ignored them. One by one, her messages sat unread, unanswered. Silence became my shield, my statement, my revenge. Because nothing unnerves someone who thrives on control more than realizing they no longer have a grip on you. Family gatherings grew heavier with tension after that night. I could see the whispers spread, even when they tried to mask them with fake smiles. My daughter-in-law's father rarely looked me in the eye anymore. When he did, it was brief, like he was afraid of what he might see reflected back. My daughter-in-law, once so smug, now carried a nervous edge. Her laughter at my expense wasn't as loud, her comments weren't as bold. She still tried. But every time her father's eyes darted toward me, she faltered. I didn't gloat. I didn't snap back with cruel words. I simply sat at their tables with dignity, listening more than speaking, letting them wonder, letting them feel the shift. Because revenge, I realized, doesn't have to come as fire and fury. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is carried out in silence, where every pause, every calm response, every act of quiet composure reminds them of the power they handed to you when they underestimated you. At work, I became sharper. Every detail in those contracts, every condition I reviewed, I handled with care. I never abused my position, never used my authority recklessly. But I made sure he understood that everything passed through me now. I made sure he saw that the woman his family had laughed at, the fat cow they had endured, was the very person who now decided the terms of his company's success. There were moments when I'd return home after those long meetings, kick off my shoes, and sit in the dim kitchen light with a slice of pie and a cup of tea. I'd think of my son, how he still hadn't defended me, how he sat in silence while they tore me apart. That wound still ached, deeper than the laughter of strangers. But I reminded myself that my strength wasn't measured by his weakness. I wasn't defined by his silence, I was defined by mine. And so I carried on, day by day. Folding sheets, brewing coffee, ironing clothes, answering emails, ordinary tasks. But with every one, I built myself stronger, steadier. My daughter-in-law's family thought they had broken me, but in truth, they had given me exactly what I needed: clarity. They wanted me to feel small. But now, every time her father walked into a boardroom and glanced nervously in my direction, I knew the truth: they were the ones shrinking. And I didn't have to raise my voice to make it happen. All I had to do was endure. It didn't happen overnight, but I began to notice the cracks forming. Tiny at first, then spreading wider like fractures in glass. My son, my own flesh and blood, who once sat in silence while his wife and her family mocked me, started to change. It was subtle at first. A glance across the table that lingered longer than usual. A half-hearted attempt to steer conversations away from me when his wife's tone turned sharp. But then, little by little, he began to speak up. One evening at a family gathering, his wife made a remark about how some people just aren't cut out for high society. Her eyes flicked toward me as though I wasn't even there, just an object to be pointed at. Before I could lower my gaze, my son's voice cut through the air, steady and sharp. "Enough," he said, his jaw tight. "Don't talk about my mother like that." The room went still. My daughter-in-law blinked in disbelief, her lips parting as though she had been slapped. It was the first time he had openly defended me in front of them, and though my heart swelled, it also ached. Where was this voice when I needed it most? Where was this strength when I sat at their table, humiliated, mocked, stripped of dignity? Still, I said nothing. I just watched him, my son, caught in the crossfire of his loyalties, trying now to rebuild something he had allowed to break. But the fractures weren't only between husband and wife. I started to hear whispers, muffled arguments behind closed doors, strained voices carrying through the hallways when they thought no one could hear. Her father's business was stumbling, deals delayed, contracts scrutinized, and he knew why. Every major decision had to pass through me now, every condition weighed carefully, every signature requiring my final approval. I wasn't vindictive, I didn't abuse my role, but I made sure the rules were followed to the letter. And in a world where shortcuts had once been their comfort, my presence became their obstacle. Their wealth wasn't disappearing, but it was shaking. Deals that once came easily now required patience. Projects slowed, partners grew impatient. And through it all, I remained silent, calm, steady, never raising my voice, never announcing my power. My daughter-in-law's father avoided eye contact whenever I entered a room, his once booming laugh replaced with cautious chuckles. And the family that had once roared with laughter at my expense now sat quieter, more careful, measuring their words before they spoke. It was strange, this new world. For once, I wasn't the weak one at the table. For once, they were the ones shrinking, tiptoeing, second-guessing their words. And yet, the satisfaction that warmed me was laced with sorrow. Because none of it could erase the memory of the night, I was humiliated. None of it could take away the sting of seeing my own son sit silently while I was torn apart. I loved him. That love never faded, even through the betrayal, even through the shame. But love doesn't erase pain, it carries it. And every time I looked at him now, I saw both. The boy I raised with my own hands, the man who sat silent when I needed him most. Late at night, folding laundry under the hum of the dryer, I would think about it. I'd press my hands against warm fabric, remembering all the years I sewed his shirts, patched his jeans, cooked his favorite meals. And then I'd hear his wife's voice in my head, mocking me, calling me a fat cow. The hurt lingered like an old wound that refused to fully heal. Still, there was a quiet strength in knowing I no longer had to fight to be seen. My silence spoke louder than their insults ever could. My dignity carried more weight than their shallow wealth. And though heartbreak remained, so did satisfaction, the knowledge that the tables had turned, that I had endured, and in my endurance, I had won. And as I sat at their table now, watching their smiles falter, their voices strain, I knew this was only the beginning. Because cracks don't just stay cracks, they spread, they widen, until the whole structure begins to crumble. The night of the gala arrived like a storm I had been quietly preparing for, even if no one else knew it. It was one of those events her family thrived on: crystal chandeliers, a ballroom filled with men in sharp tuxedos, and women in gowns that shimmered under the lights. Champagne flutes balanced effortlessly between manicured fingers. It was the kind of night where power wasn't just exercised, it was displayed. And for the first time, I wasn't entering as a bystander, a tag-along, or a woman who didn't belong. This time, I walked in knowing exactly who I was and exactly what role I played. I chose a simple black dress, elegant but modest, with a string of pearls that had once belonged to my mother. I didn't need sequins or diamonds. My strength wasn't hanging around my neck. It was written in every step I took, every calm breath, every moment of silence I had carried like armor. As I entered the ballroom, I saw the whispers start almost immediately. Eyes flicked toward me, some puzzled, some curious. My daughter-in-law's face tightened the moment she saw me. She looked like she had swallowed something sour, her painted smile trembling at the corners. Her friends gathered around her, whispering, waiting for her to make a cutting remark. But for once, She didn't. Her father, though he couldn't ignore me. Not tonight. He stood at the podium, his voice booming across the hall as he welcomed guests, investors, and partners. I stood near the back, listening, my hands folded neatly in front of me, waiting. Then it came. His eyes swept across the crowd and landed on me. That flicker of recognition again, but this time he couldn't look away. His voice wavered just slightly as he continued. "And of course," he said, clearing his throat, "I must take a moment to recognize someone whose leadership and diligence have been instrumental to our continued success. Someone who has brought vision and integrity to every contract we've undertaken." The crowd quieted. He gestured toward me, his hand trembling just enough for me to notice. "Please, join me in welcoming my new partner and the head overseeing our firm's primary contracts, Mrs. Johnson." For a moment, the world slowed. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. Hands lifted, applause swelled, and the sound filled the ballroom. People who had never looked twice at me before clapped now with respect, with admiration. The same lips that had once laughed at me, mocked me, curled now into polite smiles as though they had always known me as an equal. I walked forward calmly, each step echoing against the marble floor, and for the first time, I didn't feel small in their world. I wasn't the outsider, the woman they endured. I wasn't their fat cow. I was the woman they now had to acknowledge, the one whose silence had outlasted their cruelty. I didn't need to say much. I simply nodded, offered a small smile, and took my seat. I could feel the heat of my daughter-in-law's gaze burning into me, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, watching as her friends, her father's colleagues, the very people she had hoped to impress, clapped for me. For me. And in that moment, I understood something important. Revenge doesn't always come in the form of harsh words or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, the loudest revenge is silent dignity. Sometimes, you don't need to scream or curse, because your silence, your strength becomes louder than all the laughter that once tried to break you. As the applause faded, I sat there quietly, my heart steady, my head held high. I thought back to that night at their dining table, the sting of humiliation, the sound of their laughter ringing in my ears. And now, sitting here surrounded by clapping hands and forced smiles, I realized I had not just endured, I had risen. The tables had turned, not because I had demanded it, but because I had waited, because I had chosen dignity over anger, patience over pettiness. And now, their respect, whether real or forced, was mine. For once, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't their joke. I was the woman they could no longer ignore. The nights after the gala were quieter than I expected, but louder in other ways, in the conversations that stopped when I walked into a room, in the way people cleared their throats before speaking, in the heavy silence at family gatherings where laughter used to be easy. Michael and Rebecca's marriage didn't collapse in an instant. It unraveled in small, stubborn ways, missed calls, curt answers, arguments that started over nothing and ended with slammed doors. He tried, for a while, to hold things together, to bridge the widening gap between the life he'd built and the life he'd chosen to leave behind. But choices have consequences, and their consequences have weight. Rebecca grew quieter, not from humility, but from a sudden, awkward awareness that the world she had always navigated with ease now had edges she hadn't expected. Friends who once mirrored her sneers turned polite and distant. Invitations she once took for granted dwindled. When she walked into a room, I could see the calculations flicker across faces. Should we smile? Should we pretend we never listened to that dinner table joke? The safety net of unquestioned privilege had thinned, and she had to learn how to catch herself without it. He began to come around the house more often than he had in months. Sometimes he'd show up with takeout from the diner he used to love as a boy, the place with a red neon sign that always smelled like grease and coffee. We would sit at the kitchen table in the dim light, the same table where I had folded his shirts and mended his knees, and he'd look at me like he was trying to remember the lines of a familiar face. He said things that made me ache, apologies that stumbled out in fragments, questions about who I was in the years he'd been building a life of his own. Love doesn't erase the pain of silence, and his regret arrived wrapped in that truth. There were moments when I almost wanted to tell him everything. How each laugh at that table had felt like a hand tearing at my shirt, how I had stayed because leaving would have been a surrender I couldn't afford. But forgiveness is a quiet, complicated thing. It's not a single decision, but a series of small choices. I still loved him with a fierce, stubborn love that had shaped him from a boy into a man, and that love kept me from making his mistakes into weapons. So I listened, answered when he asked, and let the past sit between us like a book we both knew the outline of, but weren't ready to reread together just yet. Rebecca and Michael's arguments shifted in tenor. They were no longer just about schedules and money and where to place the spare key. They were about identity and pride, about the uncomfortable realization that humiliation leaves scars that bleeds into daily life. She blamed him in ways that were loud and mean, and he carried those words inside him like stones. They both hurt, but the hurt took them down different paths. In the end, their marriage showed the kind of wear that can't easily be mended by apologies or even truth. It cracked, then split, then splintered into two lives that once fit together and now did not. As for Rebecca, her world narrowed. The same people who once applauded her for being effortless now watched her with a new measure of restraint. Invitations became infrequent. Conversations at charity, functions that had once hummed with her laughter, now included her name only in passing. The humiliation she had once handed out so casually returned to her in the form of isolation. I do not relish the sight of someone suffering. I tell it because it's part of the truth. Pride that is built on diminishing others eventually turns inward. She had been quick to mock, quicker to assume superiority, and those assumptions cost her dearly. I, meanwhile, found myself in a strange place of victory and vacancy. The outward recognition, the nods of respect from people who had once looked past me, meant something a career earned, a voice finally heard. Yet it did not erase the nights of tears, the moments I'd swallowed my pride to keep peace. The image of my son, who had once sat in silence while his mother was mocked. I had wanted, more than anything, to be seen for who I was without needing someone else's approval. I had not wanted to build my dignity on the ruin of someone else. Still, the balance between justice and compassion is delicate. I remember standing in my kitchen one afternoon, the light through the window catching the flour dust on the counter and thinking about what it all meant. I had been called a fat cow. Those words had cut me down in front of people I loved, and they had changed me. But as I held the pie cooling on the windowsill, I thought of what a cow represents in the lives of many a provider of sustenance, a quiet source of strength, a creature that endures the weather and keeps giving. The insult had been meant to reduce me, but I refused to let it. Instead, I took the image and turned it into something else. Resilience, usefulness, a steady, unshowy power that doesn't demand applause. Revenge had brushed my life like a shadow at first, subtle and slow. I had not sought to destroy, only to claim the respect that had been denied to me. In the end, I chose dignity over destruction. There were nights I imagined ripping their world apart, exposing every petty cruelty, every private slight. But those imaginings were fleeting. I wanted a life I could live in with my head held high, not a spectacle I would later regret. So I let my actions at work speak. I let professionalism and competence replace the angry words that could have damaged more than just pride. I watched how their behavior adjusted when the consequences of underestimating me became clear. That shift was its own kind of retribution, and it arrived without the need for a dramatic public shaming. People ask whether I forgave. Forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It's a path I am still walking. I forgave some things because I needed to move forward. I did not forgive to forget. Some wounds I keep as reminders, not as a grudge, but as lessons about where to set boundaries and how to protect the quiet center of myself. I am kinder now to my own heart. I do not let someone else's opinion define the worth I've built by my own hands. If you stayed with me through this story, don't just click away. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And please, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story reached. It means more than you know. So I leave you with this. I was called a fat cow, but cows provide milk, strength, and life. I realized I was never the weak one, they just couldn't see it. And in the quiet that followed, I chose not to break them, but to build myself. If your child's spouse mocked you in front of the world, would you fight back or let your silence speak louder?